Have you ever played a level in a Sonic game that, despite maybe not being objectively the best, speaks to you in a very specific way that no other does? Perhaps because of the atmosphere, the setting in which it takes place, the story behind it, or you simply find its concept very interesting? Well, I know I have, and I also know that a lot of people have too. These sorts of stages, some good and others not so much, are usually overlooked when the level design of their game is discussed, or in the worst game, the game isn't even talked about to begin with. As such, today, we'll be taking a look at some overlooked levels in Sonic games, with half the suggestions being mine and the other being entirely submitted by you guys in these posts, which should be fun since I can't say I'm familiar with all of them, so thanks everyone who commented. Since there are a lot of levels in the Sonic franchise, over 1,000 in fact, including spin-offs, this will most likely be a series of sorts, so if you have any suggestion of a level you want to see talked about, feel free to comment explaining why you think it should, as long as they're not too popular. But if you're unsure if they are, just comment anyways. You can even suggest specific sections of levels instead of their entirety. Be creative. I'll also only cover one level from one specific game per episode, so that we have more variety. With that being said, let's take a look at some wronged levels. When discussing these overlooked levels, it's hard to define what can actually be considered overlooked. And as you can imagine, it's also pretty hard to come up with a criteria to classify stages like this. As such, for my suggestions, I ended up picking levels that are usually overshadowed by others in their own games, or the games themselves aren't really talked about in a more detailed way, such is the case of Secret Rings and Black Knight, for example. The most you usually hear about them is how the controls suck and how great the stories are in contrast. As for your guys' suggestions, I ended up picking the most popular ones that also fit that criteria and that I thought I could add something of value by talking about them, even if I wasn't too familiar with them beforehand. The suggestions will all be mixed, so there isn't too much of a distinction as well. Given this, let's start by taking a look at the first level that deserves to be put onto the spotlight, and it's none other than Frog Forest from Sonic Heroes. It's the 9th level for all teams in the game, taking place in a forest area with a wide variety of fauna and flora that act as gimmicks within the stage. I know how a lot of people feel about this game. Some absolutely love it, like myself, and others don't, be it because of the slippery controls, the mechanics not being fun to them, or the level design just isn't appealing enough. And they're all fair points as long as they make a difference in your enjoyment. However, as I've mentioned before, today I'm gonna be covering these stages from both an objective and subjective point of view, so that you may see them in a different light even if you still don't enjoy them that much, but can at least respect them for what they are. Such a divisive level would be this one, because it's probably one of the least forgiving if you're having trouble with its controls and mechanics, weren't it for the fact that most people probably don't even remember that this level exists or haven't thought about it in a long time, especially when compared with other popular stages from this game, such as Seaside Hill, Grand Metropolis or Casino Park. Some for better and others for worse. Another one that in times could have taken the place of Frog Forest was Egg Fleet, but it has gained a lot of popularity in recent times, and it's already considered the best level of the game and one of the best of all time by many people. Anyways, let's get back on track. Frog Forest, in my opinion, is an almost perfect mixture of some of the game's exploration elements and mainly platforming and speed. The sections that require exploration require some platforming or combat in turn, which reward the player with more items and skipping the other longer path. Even so, such amount of time can also be saved if you're skilled enough to breeze through the platforming segments, making use of the character's movement and abilities in a way that's not suggested by the game itself, such as using Sonic's spin dash off a ledge and jumping in midair, skipping the need to jump from platform to platform to get where you need to, or switching character, for example. It's rewarding in its own way, even if it might not be fully intentional. Some of these new paths also give you flavor in other ways. For instance, if you take this higher flower propeller instead of the normal one located below, the conversation between the characters will be different. These alternate paths are usually broken down in the same way throughout the level. The main path is usually the one that requires more platforming, thus it's usually the slower one unless you can come up with your own skips to maximize speed and momentum during these sections, which in turn requires you to play the level multiple times, which equals more replayability. Well, at least in theory, because it still has to be fun to be replayable, and there are the alternate paths, and while most aren't really fully fledged out, they're either just a set piece that connects you directly to the end of that specific section, or a set of platforms that contains more items, or a mix of both of these cases. The only area where I can really think of two distinct sections depending on the path you choose is that last flower propeller I mentioned, which will give you an easier and faster section if you go to the higher one, and a slower, slightly harder challenge if you go to the one below. It's an equilibrium that's been present in every game before Heroes, even if this game isn't built for it most times. There's a clear and classic separation between segments that clearly focus on the balance between speed and platforming, which was mainly what the classic games were about, and others where exploration is required to get more items and thus more points, which makes getting an A rank easier. It's a solid execution of these principles, especially in these early 3D games. With that being said, it's not all a bed of roses, because the level's flow does suffer at the hand of a few specific gimmicks. The main mechanic of both this level and the next one are the frogs, which trigger rainfall whenever they detect you, which makes new plants that turn into platforms, springs or rails grow. They are usually fine, but nothing more than fine. However, while in some areas they are placed along the path, meaning they automatically detect you and grow a platform you need to land on, I don't think it's very fun that the ones that don't activate automatically are also mandatory to progress most times, since their detection capabilities can be horrible and some plants take a long time to grow for some reason. It would make much more sense if terrain was required in most instances to access alternate paths instead, but in what concerns it actually being mandatory, it's a mechanic that could have been used in a better way. While I despise Lost Jungle as a level, I do think the way it uses the frogs is much smoother and makes more sense. The frogs also usually being associated with the flight character's platforming doesn't help, since it's definitely not one of the game's strongest points. Even so, while most levels in this game are usually designed around all of the three characters' abilities, since you know that's the main mechanic of the game, this one, much like Grand Metropolis, rarely requires the use of any besides the speed character, at least as long as you're good enough with it. Some levels make great use of all three, so it also feels like something more could have been done to truly bring out the potential of all characters, even if I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that I enjoy the other characters' playstyles more than the speed one. However, what I do enjoy the most out of this game is being able to combine all three for a seamless run, though I know some people don't feel the same way. The rest of the issues mainly have to do with the rails themselves, since they can bug out because of their unusual shape and collision. If you take that away, then they actually aren't too bad. They bring speed to the level, which is always nice, and there are usually segments after them that require you to preserve the speed gain, so they're normally a positive addition to the level flow. Speaking of which, the stage does feel cohesive and fluid most of the time, once again mostly due to the rails, loops and straights where you can freely run. These specific fast sections are used as connections between slower platforming segments, giving a logical rhythm to the level. The stage elements also tie in with its own aesthetic, which also looks great, since besides this theme not being used very often, here it's pretty original considering how the gimmicks and objects tie in with what you would usually find in a forest or swamp, such as the rails being ivies, mushrooms that become springs, and tree branches that become platforms which grow when it rains. It's also expectable to find frogs in these areas in real life, and a pretty cool detail about them is that they're usually found near small ponds in the level. What really brings all of this together in my opinion though, is the skybox. It really looks like a vast mysterious forest, yet at the same time hostile and mystic. I remember looking at it as a kid and getting my imagination going, since it's effectively a mix between a normally hostile biome and softer fantastical elements of nature, specifically the giant mushroom trees. Similarly, the track that plays throughout really captures that mystic feel, and it's also one of the best songs in the game in my opinion. All in all, it's a pretty good level that should be brought up to the conversation more often. It's always fun to replay, though not too many times in a row, and makes one of the best uses of the character's movement in this game. It's also got a pretty solid art direction, which is something this game rarely fails on. With that out of the way, let's take a look at the last level from the next mainline game after Heroes, which means we're gonna be looking at End of the World from Sonic 06. Once again, this is the final stage from the game where you play with almost every character, who are working together to gather all 7 Chaos Emeralds and resurrect Sonic before Solaris can completely destroy the fabric of reality. This one is unusual, as you may know. It's not a level in the traditional sense, since it's actually made of 7 different portions of other stages from the game, similarly to Canon's Core from SA2, and in most people's opinion, it's so bad that their brains must omit its existence, because I haven't seen anyone discuss this one in a long while, yet it's been suggested and was probably the most popular pick, which means a lot of people feel that it's notable enough to not be forgotten also. When you compare it to other levels like Wave Ocean or Crisis City, it's easy to understand why it isn't referenced too much. As I've mentioned, the level is made up of sections with almost all playable characters, except Sonic and Blaze, the former because is dead, and the latter because she's sealed in another dimension, in stages or parts of stages where they never go through normally. These object layouts are either modified layouts from another character that goes through them in the story, or are actually unused in the game itself. For example, Tails goes through Silver's starting area of Crisis City, which uses an otherwise completely unused layout that was actually intended for Silver. The only 2 levels without any segments here are Radical Train and Aquatic Base. The level's main gimmick are these eyes, called the Eyes of Solaris, which pull you in their direction, and if you touch them, you die, with the same going for enemies. To make the eyes disappear, you need to interact with these orb statues, which slow down the time-space rift that's opening and makes the eyes disappear momentarily. The more time you go without touching one, the harder the level gets, as more eyes and red rifts will appear. The latter basically throws hazards your way. Besides that, there isn't much to be said about each section really. They're the normal playstyles and level design from Sonic 06, although slightly worse honestly. It's as fun as the characters themselves are in the rest of the game. In other words, not very. I won't delve too much into each section since that would require me to actually talk about specifics from each level, which is not the point. Especially when like only 3 characters remotely fit the stage they go through, and you can skip most of these segments without barely touching the ground. For example, Tails can just go forwards towards the dash ring, climb the building, and then fly all the way to the emeralds, all in like 20 seconds. If you try to actually play the level, it isn't that bad since Tails' gameplay is reasonably good, and Crisis City's level design is normally pretty good too, so it ends up being one of the most tolerable. Omega has a slightly confusing level design at the start, and the eyes appear in a less predictable way. This section also barely has any skips, however what you can skip is definitely not intentional, since Omega can almost infinitely glide. Even so, it's still one of the characters that fits the best into their own section, considering how Omega is all about killing enemies, and this is probably the segment where combat is most prominent. The eyes are usually a problem in combat, but there aren't too many here, and the only section where there really are a bunch of them mixed in with fighting, it actually makes for a relatively fun challenge surprisingly enough, as it doesn't really feel unfair nor too hard. As for Knuckles, it's basically either skipping the entire level or suffering. You can just climb a platform and glide from one to another until you find where the emerald is, because playing this normally is pretty annoying honestly. It has a lot of combat involved and Knuckles' attacking mechanics are horrible, since they're really slow and have a seemingly non-existent hitbox, making it one of the weakest sections of the stage by far. Besides that, it doesn't have much to it. Silver, on the other hand, contrary to popular opinion, is my favorite, and that's by far. Most people don't really enjoy it much because he's slow, which makes it hard to outrun the huge number of eyes that spawn during the level, but I'll have to disagree. While it's recommended to avoid almost all enemies because the eyes will inevitably kill you, the mechanic where they pull you towards them works in your favor since you have to use another eye's pull force to escape the other one and gain more speed, being once again in my own opinion, the best and most creative use of this mechanic, of course granted that you don't attack anything. Well, I didn't manage to stay alive because I'm goated, but it is what it is. Even so, I do agree that there are parts where they really are annoying, specifically in the area after you climb the platforms that go in and out of the wall, where the chance of death is really high when you jump out of the last one. Rouge is like Knuckles' section, but much easier. Since her gliding ability has less drop-off, you can literally just climb a stone pillar and glide all the way to the emerald directly. This is actually the only section where it was impossible for me to play normally, since the Iblis Rifts kept throwing explosives at me with what seemed like aimbots. I couldn't dodge that shit in any way. Maybe it's a skill issue and it's my problem, but I don't really know about that. There isn't much to be said about it besides that though. When I said that Knuckles' segment was probably the worst, I was definitely forgetting about Amy. This one is the worst, I can confidently say that. Amy has probably the worst gameplay in the whole game, and consequently it's obvious that this section isn't fun at all. Literally nothing happens and the best solution is to avoid her painfully slow combat until the obligatory 2 enemies in front of this Cifesk Gate. It's a walking simulator if it was ugly and plain terrible, honestly. You're actually supposed to use her invisibility here to avoid the spotlights, yet it doesn't even work, you can get caught even while invisible, which is just great. And lastly, Shadow section is probably the most normal one. It may even be one of his best moments in the game, since it doesn't have the vehicles, which I frankly do not enjoy. Going through the fastest route will amount to a total of like 30 seconds of gameplay with zero obstacles for whatever reason, and trying to go to any other path is relatively fun, but the eyes spawn in less than ideal locations, which does feel a bit unfair. Regarding its aesthetics, End of the World is basically made up of other levels, but there's that nuance I mentioned that the longer you go without stopping the time-space rift, more eyes appear, the more the colors get distorted, and the harder the level gets, which from a conceptual point of view is really cool. Conceptually, it's actually one of, if not my favorite from any level of any game, but of course you have to consider the game in which it takes place, meaning the execution is not all that incredible. Even so, in terms of atmosphere, it manages to be one of the most solid executions in the entire game, which is aided a ton by the music itself, which has various movements depending on which character you play as, and the more you get close to the finish, the more desperate it gets, being accompanied by the normally grandiose and urgent feel of the main part. Another cool detail about it is that the red rifts represent Iblis and the purple ones Mephiles, and when time falls apart, both of them turn blue, which represents Solaris. End of the World is the level that leaves the most to be desired out of Sonic 06 in my opinion. Much like the rest of the game, it had great potential that just couldn't be realized with the little time the developers had. Some stuff could have been better or different, perhaps the characters going through previous levels wasn't the best idea, or maybe it should have been executed differently, and its specific gimmicks needed to be more consequential and less frustrating to the overall experience. But there's really no point in wondering what could have been, because what is still has some value. Given this, it's time to turn back time to the first 3D mainline game in the series, to Sonic Adventure, specifically to a level that not too many people remember when they think about it: Red Mountain. It serves as the 7th, 3rd and 4th action stage for Sonic, Knuckles and Gamma respectively, being an industrialized mountain range on Angel Island. While this level is not as forgotten as it once was, it still pretty much is compared to others like Emerald Coast, Speed Highway, Ice Cap or Skydeck, and even the latter could be argued for overlooked. This is probably one of my favorite levels of all time out of any Sonic game, hence why I decided to bring it to light considering how it's not talked about enough. I don't know how else to describe it, but it's a pretty cool level. Great analysis, huh? Like, look at it, everything just screams cool. It doesn't rely too much on specific gimmicks, but the ones that are present are really good, such as the small geysers that, if used correctly, can award huge time saves by skipping a good portion of ground and air time. While it also has a few alternate paths, most of them are actually slower, and if you're familiar enough with the game, it's harder to even end up there. They are used as punishment for slow reactions instead of a reward for good movement and platforming skills, meaning meaning that most of the time gain is to be made with a spin dash like in the majority of SA1's levels, even if there is one specific alternate path in Act 1 that I can remember that actually saves a lot of time, being the one with the numbered jump panels. Considering how this level is more open than most, there are a lot of opportunities for creative shortcuts and outside-the-box thinking which aren't normally rewarded. An example is this specific shortcut, where you can see a barrier on the left signaling that you can't go there, yet you can jump over it to get to the rocket below, removing the need of going around the mountain to descend. While this may seem simple, it's a level of freedom that you only come to appreciate when it's taken away from you. Act 2 does have a lot more alternate paths which do reward exploration with rings and lives, and mixing platforming and speed well by giving you a perfect level arrangement to do so, but we'll get into specifics in a moment. Act 1 is, again in my opinion, an actually perfect mixture of speed and platforming elements, much like the rest of the game, but better. Of course, going through the level as fast as you can has the downside of not collecting items, especially since there are a lot of them in this level for those who decide to do so, but it's still extremely replayable regardless of whichever playstyle you elect, to a degree that is perhaps hard to achieve for most levels of the same style or time. Act 2 takes spin dash skips to an extreme, which can be used to not only take advantage of momentum physics to reach higher paths and collect items, but to utilize it in a way that perfectly makes use of the level's division into small platforming segments, connected by long straights to build momentum and keep it during set segments to get the best possible time and a seamless run, either by creating your own shortcuts with a spin dash or using the built momentum to smoothly cruise across the platforms. Even with that, the platforming itself isn't bad at all, it's pretty good. Generally, it's just a really fluid, smooth level requiring almost no stopping or waiting for gimmicks, which are usually the weakest suits when it comes to levels that are considered not very good in Sonic games. The spin dash skips are always fun, and the stage in general seems much more designed around this than others, to the same degree as Speed Highway and Twinkle Park, although a bit more than the latter maybe. Act 1 sets a clear priority of speed over precision in most cases, even if being careful is still required because you can easily fall to your death as the stage is made of bottomless pits, while Act 2 slows stuff down a bit by mixing set precision with speed, especially since you can't stay on the platforms for too long because they'll go under the lava. This scores the level a lot of points when we talk about cohesion with its aesthetic, since it's logical that a section that takes place in the mountains and has you go over and under the clouds multiple times with a fast-paced song would focus much more on adrenaline than a section that takes place underground and looks dangerous, along with a song that, in itself, sounds aggressive. Speaking of which, Act 1's aesthetic is probably one of my favorites in the entire series, as it does a perfect job, considering the resources it has, at giving the sensation that you're really in a mountainous/volcanic area, and the fact that you go under and above the clouds multiple times highlights the verticality of the level, since you start basically at the top of the mountain, working your way down to the depths of the volcano until you reach the second act. The small lava lakes at the surface are only a glimmer of what's to come underground. A big cave full of lava, machinery, skulls and prisoners. The question of what's Eggman doing here also arises, like is he mining for something, who or what are the prisoners? Unlike other volcanic levels, this one is more interesting in the sense that it's sort of unnerving and unnatural, since it was made to feel and be even more dangerous than what it's already like normally. It really has a creepy vibe, which is added by the skull decorations, not being something that you usually see in the series. There's a good contrast between the wind blowing in Act 1 and the bubbling of the lava in Act 2, which signals the difference of a tranquil environment compared to an aggressive one. Red Mountain stands out to me mainly because of its contrasting dual section design, which creates one of the most varied levels in the game. The music shift from high energy rock to an eerier one reinforces set thematic depth, and the environmental storytelling suggests some ancient mysteries and Eggman's activities in the place. The fact that the gameplay focus also changes in both acts is specifically designed to keep you engaged and force you to adapt your strategy, and it works pretty well. I also have to shout out Knuckles' level, It's really open, and gliding through the canyon is one of the most beautiful times I had with this game. Maybe it's a bit too vertical, which makes it harder than normal, but Knuckles is built for these sorts of environments, so it's not too daunting. Now it's time to go back to 2D, where we'll stay for a while, as next is another of your guys' suggestions in the form of... Marble Garden from Sonic 3 and Sonic 3 and Knuckles. It's the third zone of the game, being an ancient city also located on Angel Island, much like the previous stage. I'm not gonna lie, this is a great suggestion since I never think about this level, yet it's more notable to me than others like Launch Base or Sandopolis. Of course, this happens because of levels like Angel Island, Hydro City or Hydrocity, Ice Cap, Mushroom Hill, Flying Battery. You get it, basically every single stage in the game. The only time I thought about this level was when I made my long-ass level design video a year and a half ago, and that was to illustrate that a single path in a level from Sonic 3 is basically a whole level in Sonic 2, including all of its alternate paths, which, despite being quite a hyperbole, is still a somewhat fair assessment, as you'll see. This is one of the slowest levels in the game, even if that's not saying much considering that it still contains a fair amount of speed sections, but it focuses a lot more on platforming and exploration over that. Looking at the map of the entire Act 1, you can easily see that the level is enormous, and that's why I said that a single path from this level amounts to what seems like a whole level from Sonic 2. This is, weirdly, one of the few levels where going through the higher path can be slower overall, since if you stay in the top path for too long, you'll reach a dead end and then you'll have to descend all the way down to the lowest path to get to the boss, which is relatively time consuming. Sure, the top path does have easier platforming and less hazards, and the lower ones have you going in the opposite direction a lot more times, which... yeah, it probably ends up amounting to the same thing. Even so, it feels like the medium path is the best balance, still having more stuff to collect than the lower one, and gives you the most solid and rounded experience of the whole level. This act also has the nuance that, if you fall down at specific areas in the stage, you'll get teleported to the top. This happens at the start of the act, where you'll just keep falling until you land on something, and at the middle of the lowest path, which will put you back at the beginning of the level but on the highest path. This act also has a much more multi-layered layout than Act 2, meaning its main point is connection and movability between different paths by adding multiple platforming segments that allow you to easily traverse between them. Even with that, the level still feels pretty fast, since there are several gimmicks such as the spinning tops that can be used both for exploration and for speed. This one specifically uses both to aid you in getting to higher areas and to make you go really fast and break walls and floors in the way, making them really versatile in combination with a considerable number of long straights between platforming, with loops, slopes and downhills contributing to the stage's overall really fluid feel. There's a relatively high amount of space that lets you run while avoiding obstacles in the way, throwing in some precision work and the need to preserve momentum, and the platforming feels logical and is really fun due to it being quickly traversed with smart timing and keeping your speed at the same time, giving the level a really satisfying rhythm. It's hard to explain if you've never played it or haven't in a long time, but it just feels nice. I'd go as far to say that it's one of the best mixes of platforming, speed and precision out of any classic game, even if the act is like 80% platforming in total. Even so, one of the biggest arguments against this act is that it's too long, and I understand. At some point it does feel like the level is endless, and it does overstay its welcome a bit, especially considering how it's just enormous by nature and has more layers than a lasagna or something. Generally, a high degree of depth and planning in a level is always welcome, but add too much and you spoil it, and this is certainly a case that may not appeal to everyone. I don't totally hate this principle, but I can't really sit here and solely defend it. Act 2 on the other hand has a layout that's a bit more focused and less quote-unquote confusing per se. While Act 1 can be daunting because it's almost impossible to create a mental map of its layout, if you look at the second act, you can see more simplicity and linearity in the paths and challenges of the level itself. The level isn't so vertical, which results in less required mobility to go from the lower to higher pathways, and even if it still is pretty large and focuses on platforming and exploration, it's evident that it tries to add more traditional speed segments into its layout to balance things out. This act also swaps the spinning tops for pulleys that transport you to higher areas, and brings back others such as the rotating platforms, the mud ponds that kill you if you go deep enough, the long pathways between platforming segments, etc. However, it also introduces a very specific gimmick: landslides. Along certain areas in the stage, Eggman causes an earthquake of sorts which alters the terrain. In this case, it can both give in, meaning you'll have to descend into lower paths, or rise compared to the rest of the level, forcing you to quickly go to higher ground, requiring some quick thinking as to not get crushed. With that being said, I do believe it to be a good balance between two contrasting elements, in other words, of slow precise platforming and free running segments. Aesthetically, I can't say it's the most appealing to me specifically, but I do recognize the cohesion and lore efforts present between the stage elements and the vision for the story tells in the bigger picture of the game. Marble Garden is located somewhere in Angel Islands, like the other levels, with Sonic and Tails ending up in there after being shot out of Hydro City, suggesting both of these zones are relatively close by. While that level seems like an underwater ruin, Marble Garden itself also seems like ruins of an ancient civilization. The Knuckles' clan village in SA1 also seems to be at least partially inspired by this sort of aesthetic, which is a nice piece of continuity considering how both are supposedly located in Angel Islands. The music fits pretty well with the aesthetic, and it's probably the most underrated in this game honestly. It has a mysterious and liminal tone that really transports you to an area of the like. It's hard to explain, but it just sounds like overgrown ruins. If you get the vision, you get it. The track for Act 2 is basically the same, but it somehow sounds like a harder version of Act 1, which is normal for these sorts of songs, even if Act 2 is more different than hard. Marble Garden is a hard stage to talk about, because it's both incredibly detailed and fleshed out in theory, and while it is pretty good in practice too, it's perhaps too much to be digested in a single sitting. Everything seems mostly logical, and the level feels pretty fluid and challenging in a fair way, but it does overstay its welcome a bit and would perhaps benefit from being shorter. While a lot of people don't really like Sonic 1 because of its 3-act system, this one feels like 4 acts divided into just 2, feeling like way too much at times, yet still being a really solid level overall. Speaking of Sonic 1, we're headed straight there, as next we'll be taking a look at Starlight Zone. It's the 5th and penultimate zone of the 16-bit version of the game, taking place in a construction area in a city located on South Island. Nowadays, I feel like barely anyone even talks about Sonic 1's levels, excluding Green Hill. The only other levels that are sometimes brought to the conversation are like Marble Zone because it sucks, and Labyrinth Zone because it sucks. Even if it isn't as overlooked as it once was, Starlight is still pretty much ignored when the best 2D levels are discussed, when in my opinion it would make that list. I may be too bad at Sonic 1, and 2D Sonic in general, to be able to stick to the higher paths, but Sonic 1's level design is almost always divided in the same way. Higher path equals faster and easier, lower path equals slower and harder, and middle path equals more or less a combination of both. There's a lot of opportunity for failure in this level, since even if you're in the higher path, at any given moment you can either fall down to a lower path because of the fence that block your path or blow you off, and the holes between platforms that you can't read where they lead to, which in most instances is nowhere, as the stage is littered with bottomless pits. In Sonic 1, most levels are focused in platforming and slower gameplay, like the mentioned Marble and Labyrinth zones. However, Green Hill and Starlight are the exceptions to this, since they focus more on speed via slopes, loops, and in this case, seesaws that require the usage of movement to extract their highest potential, which in turn leads to more momentum build-up later on. Given this, it's probably the level that focuses the most in verticality. Even so, there's still a huge focus on balancing that speed element and platforming, much like in every other classic game, but in this one it's always a bit different compared to the others. Take Act 3 for example. This is a level that, depending on which path you take, you get hugely different experiences. While in other games you still get a few speed elements in the lower routes, this one has you basically platforming all the time with barely any opportunity to build momentum. The other ones have a ton of loops and downhills and whatnot, which is to be expected, but it's a weird contrast in hindsight, yet one that is very unique to Sonic 1. The platforming in this stage usually takes form in those seesaws with the bombs, the floors that turn into stairs, and the moving platforms over bottomless pits, each with its own depth. For example, the seesaws are useful to get to higher, faster routes and collect item boxes, which contributes to the still very prominent exploration element. Preventing the floor from transforming into stairs may grant access to a faster route, since sometimes they block your path or force you to go another way, and the moving platforms require precision and timing as to not fall down to your death. The higher paths make regular use of momentum to go through or to even get there, like in other levels, but here it's vital considering the ridiculous number of bottomless pits. The only thing that usually block these pathways and do require this momentum buildup are the fans I mentioned, since you can only bypass them by having enough speed. Since it's also one of the quote-unquote fastest levels in the game, it's also one of the most fluid and smooth. It's hard to explain by words alone, but you can just look at the map and see why it would feel so, with the sheer number of curved and linear pathways with loops, slopes, etc., instead of having 1,000 platforms and paths with a number of different topologies. The stage is sort of a breather after Labyrinth Zone and before Scrap Brain Zone, that most likely being the intention of the level designers. It's very aesthetically pleasing, combining with the level design in the sense that it has a very relaxed atmosphere, contrasting with both previous and future levels, as well as with the industrial setting itself, reinforcing the level's emphasis on movement and flow rather than overwhelming you with intensity. The dark, starry sky also contrasts with the usually bright and vibrant color palettes, and the city in the background leaves it ambiguous whether it's in Eggman's control or if it's simply abandoned. To fit that relaxed atmosphere, the stage has basically no enemies. The most dangerous enemy in this level are the stage hazards, specifically the bottomless pits, which function in an opposite manner of the level, which eases you into it, looking harmless, yet it's full of passive hazards, like timed bombs and enemies that don't attack you but hurt you if you try to. In my head, there's sort of a correlation that the enemies are like sleeping animals, they'll only attack you if they feel threatened, giving a sort of distant feel to the level elements, much like of the stage setting itself. I don't really know if I'm making myself clear, but it feels like you're an observer here rather than actually being there, especially because you don't really know where you are, while other levels usually make their location clear via specific points of interest or landmarks. Here it's just a city, a construction site and a night. Starlight is a very special level. It's good, there's no doubt about that, yet it's good in its own different way, I think. The level plays and feels nice, yet what interests me the most is exactly its setting, and how much it contrasts with basically every single level in the franchise if you think about it. It really gets my imagination going, and it's why I like it so much basically. With that being said, it's time to move to the next mainline game after Sonic 1, being Sonic CD, where we'll be taking a look at Quartz Quadrant. It's the fourth round in the game, consisting in a cave region full of quartz crystals, being located in Little Planet. To be fair, I think that any pick from this game that isn't the main levels, aka Palm Tree Panic, Stardust Speedway and Metallic Madness, would be a legitimate one. However, this was the one that was suggested by a considerable number of people, and it's easy to understand why, since it's arguably one of the best in the game for multiple reasons, yet it's barely ever discussed. Of course, the other lesser known stages also have their own merits, but that's for another episode perhaps. Like any other level from Sonic CD, the focus of this stage is exploration over anything else, since the quote-unquote intended way to play Sonic CD is to warp to the past version of the level, destroy the robot transporter present in the first two acts so you're able to create a good future for the third one. Do this for all levels and you'll get a good ending. As you may come to realize, the fact that this game is much more focused on this slower aspect makes it really polarizing in a series that's mostly about speed and going forwards to create a sense of progress instead of backtracking, especially when the levels don't really try too hard to balance this exploration element with Sonic's speed in most instances. Note the usage of most. Personally, I don't mind it, but I do understand why others would. Some stages can be pretty confusing, which can make locating the transporters a tiring and daunting task. Fortunately, Quartz Quadrant actually has a pretty simple and predictable layout that's easy to understand after like a minute or so. In my playthrough of this level, I literally time traveled right beneath the transporter in both acts by accident, so I was pretty lucky to not need to look for it. But I had tried to record gameplay of this stage before, though I had to leave before finishing it, and I spent like 5 minutes in the first act alone trying to find the transporter, which in hindsight was stupidity on my part, so take it as you will. As you might also expect, the different time periods of the stage also have a few differences between each other. The past feels a bit bare bones, if you will, at least compared to the other versions, meaning that it has simpler, straighter paths, and while the present has, for example, bridges that connect platforms, the past doesn't. The present also has these tubes from where you can either go forwards or downwards, but the past layout usually blocks these passages and adds a spring to send you backwards. My headcanon is that these hollows eroded with time and eventually led to the other side of the platform, or that they were mined, considering how Quartz Quadrant is a clearly explored mine in the present, bustling with machinery and being filled with conveyor belts, yet is almost fully intact in the past. The future versions are opposite between each other too. The bad future has a really bumpy layout, as the paths are really jagged and there's barely anything smooth to be seen or felt, also adding a lot of obstacles compared to all other layouts. The good future, on the other hand, kinda feels like a mix of all previous time periods, as it too has more complex paths like the bad future, but less enemies like the past, and more places where you can get items and explore like the present, also having its own quirks, mainly being easier due to the addition of more springs and the like. Design-wise, as I shallowly mentioned before, the level is pretty simple. There's a clear division between a top path, a middle one and the lowest, as well as a division of the level into thirds, the first segment before the transporter and the remaining two after it. In this first section, there's a clear perception that the pathways are much simpler to make time warping easier. In the present, the top path is the one that has the time warp sign to the past the soonest, as well as the easiest path to time travel. The middle path also has it, however it's located at its end, forcing you to warp either backwards or forwards, which can make you easily miss where the transporter is supposed to be. The past layout transforms the top path into an eventual dead end, forcing you to descend into the middle one and find the springs that lead you to the transporter. The second section assumes that you've already destroyed the transporter, as it's a layout that's much more traditional, meaning that it actually focuses on speed and simple obstacles to overcome on a top route, which is basically a reward for doing so and easily leads to the end of the stage. The middle to low paths are a mix of both speed and platforming, serving to punish you for not finding the transporter, or if you somehow missed the really easy jump from the transporter to the higher routes. It's evident that there's almost no exploration to be made, as there are very few connections and opportunities to move between different routes. Lastly, the third section exists, I guess? I don't know what to say about it. It has basically nothing. It's really open and has a few rings to collect, but besides that I don't really know. Aesthetically, it's just a beautiful level, maybe one of my favorite level themes. As its name suggests, Quartz Quadrant takes place in and out of a purple-colored quartz mine full of machinery in the present, where you can see set quartz crystals and stalactites in the distance, which add to the depth perception of how big it really is. When you go outside, it looks like a normal forest area, similar to Green Hill or Palm Tree Panic in this case, with what seem to be trees in the distance and waterfalls between the rocks. In the past, the purple palette turns into green, and while the cave looks dry in the present, it's full of a beautiful yellow-green water with crystals in it. On the outside is located probably one of my favorite themes and backgrounds out of any Sonic level, an idyllic scenery of a river with soft and pretty colors. To be honest, I can't really describe it in a way that make it justice. In the bad future, the mine has basically nothing besides machines and lava that rose most likely due to aggressive mining, and the outside is sort of beautiful in a fucked up kinda way. It looks like a massive metropolis, with the lights giving it some hope compared to its dark and industrial backdrop. Finally, for the good future, I'll be completely straight. I have no idea what's happening in this cave. It's really pretty and doesn't look completely destroyed, and the outside is also full of human intervention, but nature was preserved. In reality, it's sort of a reflection of the inevitability of the humankind expanding its domain over the planet and pushing nature back. But a good future presents a balance between that and the fact that both human-made creations and nature can coexist somewhat peacefully, or something along those lines. Depending on the time period, the platform's floor and other level elements also change, and while in the present there's still a mix of the natural elements of the cave as well as the human builds, with bridges and unfinished wood pathways, the past is fully made of natural elements, like plants, stones and trees. Given this, the conveyor belts that exist in all versions of the level don't do here. Well, they are present, but don't work if I remember correctly. The bad future clearly transforms the level in a setting of dead and rotten vegetation, with everything being mechanical and the floor transformed into an assembly line of sorts. In contrast, the good future stays mechanic, but nature does make more healthy appearances, working to create a really pleasant color scheme. As for the music, there's a great video by Alex Yard properly explaining and analyzing it, so if you want an analysis that doesn't suck, then be sure to check out his video. I'll only be speaking for the European/Japanese sound soundtrack because I'm only familiar with that one. The song that plays in the present is, as to be expected, an absolute banger and fits pretty well into the level theme. It's hard to explain for me, but it just sounds like bright crystals, and somewhat like Palm Tree Panic, especially when you consider that it apparently takes place close to there. It also includes a motif from the good future, like a hint to what the objective is, which is a nice detail. The past track uses instruments that sound more natural, which is to be expected, but it also ends up sounding pretty different from the present, being its own kind of vibe. The bad future sounds exactly like what its voice sample says. It's aggressive, hostile, and at the same time a great song that builds adrenaline and tension to leave that rotten place. Finally, the good future music is perhaps my favorite from the game, and of all Sonic games really. It perfectly reflects the fact that you've saved the place, being really calm, happy and relaxing, a worthy reward. Quartz Quadrant is a level that really should be discussed more often, not only for how it plays, but for what it is. It's a pretty special one, having a theme that's barely ever featured in a game, and a story and atmosphere of a kind that's not really discussed enough or matched by any level of its kind. It's really an overlooked gem in mine and your guys' opinion apparently, so it's always fun to talk about it. Next, we'll be finally leaving 2D levels for a bit, as quite a jump into the future is expecting us, as now we'll be taking a look at... Night Palace from Sonic and the Secret Rings. It's the 8th and final world in the game, serving as Eraser Jin's floating strongholds. The palace itself has another dimension, resembling space with roads made of glass in what's a really ethereal and mystical setting. I chose Night Palace since no one talks about Secret Rings regarding its levels. People usually only talk about the controls and the story, and that's about it. Even if Night Palace might be one of the more known levels of the game, the latter in general just gets ignored beside its defects or superficial qualities. Even if this stage is talked about sometimes, I feel like it's never to the degree that it deserves to be, with a lot of contextual elements, as well as details, getting ignored when they should really be brought into the spotlight. Since this is the last level of the game, it's expectable that it combines every element of the previous ones and ramps it up to the extreme, while also adding its own mechanics and gimmicks. And it does, as this is probably the hardest level in the game. It's also split into 3 clear sections. The first has you going through narrow ground while also avoiding spikes as to not die, requiring really precise timing and inputs. Then it leads you to a much more open and simpler path where you have to kill some enemies, avoid the spike balls, and run to the next segment, which is the flying carpet. The second area is basically an auto runner, where you only need to dodge obstacles and preferably collect a maximum number of items you can. I know a lot of people don't really enjoy this set piece, but I think it's fine honestly. Avoiding the enemies at the end is a nice challenge in itself. After you jump off of the carpet, you're sent into the third, last, and in my opinion, best section of the stage, where the inside of the palace stretches and you have to run through 3 small set pieces while avoiding lances that fall from the sky and shatter the floor below. The end of this area teleports you back to the palace in a room where a guest tries to kill you, meaning you have to run fast, either with the speed break or avoiding as many obstacles as possible, to reach the hourglass and not die. In general, it's Secret Rings' level design through and through. It's as good as it can be with the Wiimote's controls. I won't even drag this for too long, since I wouldn't be the first or the last to do it, nor do I care enough. But you can't judge these levels based on what you know from other more quote-unquote normal Sonic games, since they don't apply at all. Anyways, the progression in difficulty seems natural, as it gets harder the further you get into the level, even if the start is already pretty difficult by nature, but it really does get much harder by the time you get inside the palace, especially because the gimmicks present require even faster reactions and timing, and the enemy placement is less forgiving for those who don't master the controls yet. Speaking of which, the level layout is built by specific key elements. Firstly, linear paths with split-second decision making. Contrary to other Sonic games, both Secret Rings and Black Knight are entirely linear given how they're practically auto-runners and don't have any type of alternate routes. Considering how Sonic is supposed to be fast and he's stupidly quick in this game, many obstacles require really fast precision and decision capabilities to effectively finish the level without dying dozens of times, which took me like 10 playthroughs until I started to understand the stage and get the hang of it. For those who like it, it's a great reason to replay it, especially because this game is really rewarding when you do know how to play, but for the majority of people it's understandably more frustrating than it is fun, since the controls are not all that responsive even if the levels are built entirely with them in mind. Even so, this has as a side effect a somewhat on-rails gameplay, which doesn't allow for much freedom to explore and restricts the player to what sometimes feels like an interactive movie. I know this might be a crazy opinion, but I'm not even on my hater shit, because I do enjoy this game. Secondly, a separation between sections dedicated to speed and others for precision. This is much like any other game, but balancing both in the same sections is harder here. For example, the section where you slowly progress with your back against the wall is entirely made of precision, and the sections that try to mix both, like the one with the falling spike balls on the stairs, leave a lot to be desired. An example of some that do this pretty well though are the ones with the glass floors in space, since you can tell beforehand where the lances will fall, giving you enough time to switch paths, keeping your speed while also requiring split-second decision making. It's relatively easy to not die in these sections if you understand it early, but if you don't, then it really is frustrating. The fact that the collision detection of the missing floors isn't the best also doesn't help, because you can fall through without ever stepping on the holes. However, the areas after these, the ones with the gas, are so much worse at balancing these elements, in the sense that they're really cluttered and have a lot of targets to use the homing attack on. In my experience, I really couldn't go through these without using the speed break or having the speed abilities on the skill rings, which you should have by the time you get here. Call it a skill issue or whatever, because I do realize that it is to some degree, but it feels like these weren't play tested at all. They could and should be simpler. Even so, this intentional push and pull dynamic still makes the level feel very engaging and skill based rather than just an automatic roller coaster ride, like some other levels from the game do. Nonetheless, some of the intentional momentum breakers are, like in the rest of the game, too harsh, since the enemy encounters are usually found in places where slowing down is pretty hard, and the traps/obstacles are not very fun or easy to navigate in this specific stage. And thirdly, on the same note, the behavior/positioning of the objects and enemies themselves. It's evident that the objects work in a way that force movement. After all, the controls don't work for slow and static gameplay. Given this, staying put for too long has its consequences, usually resulting in falling off platforms or taking damage and dying. One enemy present multiple times throughout the level that also forces quick thinking and movement are the red Majin, the ones that breathe fire, since you can't attack them directly without taking damage, killing you instantly. You can only defeat them by taking out the green Majin first, which sometimes appear between two red ones in an arrangement of 3. With that being said, enemy encounters are most times recommended to be avoided, especially on the carpet segment. Generally, these obstacles are used as a way to punish reckless movement, though it results in more repetitive layouts since the recipe required ends up always being the same, like the lance and gas sections, which are always the same but in different flavors. Aesthetically, it's one of the best designed levels out of any Sonic game, that much is clear as water. There's a significant contrast between the two primary settings. The first is a gargantuan palace in the middle of the air, which, despite being fanciful in of itself, still takes ideas and references from real architectural styles of Islamic culture, specifically Persian, with ornate granite domes, towering minarets, and intricate patterns. The second takes place in what appears to be space, on top of translucent white platforms that appear to be made of glass or some sort of crystal, creating an otherworldly dreamlike setting that has an ethereal and mystical feel that both contrasts with the more realistic environment of the first part of the level, yet somehow also manages to capture that fanciful design, setting up a more grandiose set piece in what is a preparation for the final boss. Unlike earlier levels like Levitated Ruin and Evil Foundry, which are more mechanical and chaotic, Night Palace feels majestic and controlled. Since a good level should feel consistent in its design philosophy, to me that just feels like an absolute masterclass, as it really does feel like Sonic is running through an enchanted world, which is aided by the actual game and level mechanics, scoring it a lot of points regarding setting and level design cohesion. Of course, the stage is the way it is to tell a story, namely that of the Arabian Nights, hence the architectural style, but the fact that the palace is so big also reflects the sheer power of Eraser Jin, as he chose this as his final stronghold, suggesting that it's the core of his power, and grandiose architecture has been used throughout human history to emanate exactly that, power. On that note, the music that plays in this level just feels powerful. It has epic instruments with a quick beat, yet they transmit a sensation of melancholy through the lyrics, in what seems like Sonic lamenting the possibility of him dying and surrenders himself to whatever fate will bring him. These elements amount to the true weight of the stage and its atmosphere and importance in the grand scheme of the game. Night Palace is much like Quartz Quadrant to me, as it matters more what the level is intrinsically rather than how good it is objectively. It's a stage that's epic, grandiose, iconic, and truly a design masterclass. It emanates an aura that very few levels do, and for that it deserves all the attention I can get it by talking about it. But I guess that's enough for 3D levels for a bit, as next we're going back to 2D with Titanic Monarch from Sonic Mania. It's the 12th and final zone of the game, being the secret base of the hard-boiled Heavies and Eggman, hosting a colossus of a robot. As with the other levels, this one is also made of 2 acts. While speaking of quote-unquote overlooked Mania levels is a bit hard, since everyone knows that Mania has pretty famous and good original levels, and the other ones are mostly remakes of other iconic stages, besides Oil Ocean, I guess. Titanic Monarch is probably the one out of those that's the least talked about or remembered, especially because a lot of people don't really like it. What does make this level really notable though, is the fact that, contrary to other levels in Mania, or classic Sonic in general, where the objective is to run forwards as much as possible until you get to the goal, here is to get as high as possible, at least in Act 1 that is. With that being said, this is probably the most vertical level out of any Sonic game, like to an absurd extent. Given this, it's to be expected that it utilizes its gimmicks in a way that lets you climb it, having bumper walls, magnetic spheres and springs, with the latter's majority being hidden and only appearing to save you from what feels like a drop to the bottom of the entire stage. These gimmicks specifically use momentum against you, since in the majority of cases, these obstacles require you to slow down and be careful, or if you're really good, you need to perform really precise inputs with the correct timing to keep said momentum, which is not really doable for most people in their first runs. One such example are these twin poles from where electric current passes between. In my own playthrough, I just tried to run across them without paying much attention because I wanted to preserve my speed, which means I got punished for it, while the fact that they blend too well into the background doesn't help, but I digress. Being able to control the direction and balance of the magnetic sphere to be able to gravitate another or reach higher ground and skip some platforming is absolutely essential, as well as calculating the timings of jumps correctly due to platforms that move or other gimmicks like cogs. The level design requires you to be able to read it quickly and properly, since these gimmicks exist both to help and to punish. Such an example is this clip of me being stupid when trying to break this ring box but ending up hitting the bumper wall and landing on spikes not once but twice. There are also other mechanics like the swinging bars that send you in the same direction you came from but with more momentum, which can be used to gain even more speed during the usual free running segments, but to also send you onto higher pathways in some instances where it wouldn't be possible otherwise, giving the level a nice balance between the need of mastering the mechanics but also granting it some unpredictability, which is fitting of a final stage. It's obvious that Titanic Monarch is about precision and mastering the game's physics and controls more than anything. Also, even if the level is really vertical, which makes it immediately associated with platforming, most of the climbing is actually done through loops, slopes, and other mechanics like those cars driven by the Egg Robos, being a great example of a mix between a ton of different playstyles. Additionally, having this quirk in mind, it's also deducible that this level doesn't have many alternate paths, or any at all. And in fact, it doesn't. It's one of the most linear 2D levels of the series, which doesn't really mean anything in this case, since it's still pretty engaging due to the challenge it presents not being too easy nor frustrating. It always feels, well, most times at least, fair in a really fun but somewhat hard way while still keeping you in a specific set route, which is definitely not something that's easy to do. Considering how Act 2 takes place inside a giant robot, it makes sense that the previous act takes place on the outside, around the roads and skyscrapers that surround it, making you climb the robot from the outside and eventually entering it from the top. Speaking of Act 2, let's take a look at it. Its start is pretty similar to Act 1's, but the way it works is very different. The level structure isn't what you typically expect, since when you get to a certain point, you'll reach a sort of hub area between 4 different sections. You'll have to warp to each individually, with said section being closed off when you complete it, and after completing all, a portal will appear which takes you to the boss. These small segments are much like what you've seen in Act 1, but slightly on steroids. Firstly, they almost always start in a way that you have to slow down a little and find out what the correct path to take is, since if you blindly throw yourself into it, you'll most likely fall down and get teleported to the start by the ruby mist, as this act completely removes the safety of the floor in these areas. With that said, there isn't much else to be said. These sections are considerably harder compared to the ones from Act 1, truthfully being small challenges, in size not in difficulty, requiring even more precision, cool, and having a bigger sense of exploration and awareness of your surroundings. There's much less speed involved, which is to be expected in this sort of stage. While I can't say that I enjoyed my time playing this act at all, in hindsight I do appreciate what it tries to do, since in theory it does execute its vision pretty well, and my lack of more appreciation for it simply boils down to the fact that I suck at classic Sonic games, so yeah. The stage also feeling more hostile in that sense of being harder also perfectly reflects the atmosphere of being a final level and the one that tests everything you've learned throughout the game, since for all intents and purposes it's the last big challenge before the final boss. Even so, contrary to other stages like Metropolis Zone, Titanic Monarch is indeed challenging but not frustrating, or not to that degree at least, since it really does focus more on true skill and not distasteful enemy placement and unfairly punishing level design. Even if most obstacles are designed to waste your time, they rarely feel illogical. The fact that this stage requires a completely different approach in what regards movement is also a breath of fresh air, since not many levels require it, especially in 2017, and we all know what happened that year, even if the game is not modern per se. All in all, it's a level that combines the elements from other final levels, which fits perfectly with a visually oppressive environment, with ominous, endless structures, reflecting the true power we're at odds against. The deep and cold color palette also resembles Metropolis and Death Ex's Final Gauntlet aesthetic, even if it now has a more modern presentation and, given the bigger capacity of both software and hardware, intense and grandiose. The teleporting mechanics combined with the climbing create a sort of disorientating effect, surreal even, making the structure feel larger than life itself. The music also does a great job at emanating this aura. It sounds mechanic, menacing, grandiose. It even has the same high tones and slightly disturbing notes that other Eggman related tracks have. Act 2's track is even more intense to signal that we're getting close to the end. Titanic Monarch is a unique one for sure. While I do love Act 1 and don't really enjoy Act 2, I can appreciate its entirety for its meaning and atmosphere. While other levels like Studiopolis, Press Garden and Mirage Saloon are much more iconic from both an artistic and technical point of view, this level should be remembered more, for it is also a great one that deserves the attention. And lastly, for my suggestions, it's time to go back to 3D in a very popular game, Sonic Adventure 2, even if Pyramid Cave isn't the most loved level that came of it. It's an indoor Egyptian ruin-themed stage, with large murals and hieroglyphs found within. Since it's a base belonging to Eggman, the statues have had their heads replaced by ones with his face. While this is a stage that I've honestly only seen people say that they don't really enjoy it much, and while I do understand why, I still like it a lot. It's also made of a more closed environment compared to stages like Green Forest, not having a whole lot of alternate paths to take. We all know that SA2 is a very popular game, which may make this pick feel strange, and while I did want to include other stages from the game of other characters, and will do so eventually, Pyramid Cave is a stage that's always been wronged in my opinion, even if the general public perception of it has positively switched somewhat. The level is divided into the following sections. First, you have a purely speed-focused start. This stage, much like almost all other Sonic specific in this game, starts with a small set piece purely focused on speed to introduce how it and momentum in the level itself work. Then you get to the first hourglass, which introduces how it works, opening doors for a short amount of time as well as the time-based platforms. Shortly after, you get to this small area where you're introduced how the keys work, and after this you get to the first large grind rail, which shows you how big of a time save riding it provides and what expects you shall you fail to do so. From this point on, the level tests what you've learned so far. The first of these sections mixes both the large grind rail and the second key, which are completer and more complex. If you fall off the rail, you'll go through a slower path which requires facing some enemies and waiting for the door to open. Next, you'll have to fall down, or go through the door, try to avoid the ghost next to the key as well as the bullets fired by the robots, and transport the key to the top of the ramp and put it in its slot. Being able to go through this area while avoiding the enemies and obstacles will provide the best time, but not the best opportunity to get items and points if you want to. After unlocking the door, you have another mix of two mechanics, the speed section, much like the starting one, as well as an hourglass, which means you have to reach the door at the end of this area before the time ends. Otherwise, you'll have to fall through this hole and start the section again. On the other hand, you can progress slowly in your first run as to collect all the items and lives, and in the second, then go through it as fast as possible, which should be easier than going in blind since you already know where the ghosts are, as they can grab you if they get too close, completely killing your momentum. The last few segments after these are simpler, usually just throwing in some hourglass doors and timed platforms which you can avoid by grabbing the top rail, forcing you to move quickly as a result. Given this, the natural progression of the integration of these mechanics becomes apparent. The hourglasses, for instance, have an increasing complexity. Their first appearance is simple and forgiving, you only have to hit it and go through the door with little opportunity for failure. However, as you keep going, they become less forgiving, since they also introduce enemies, multiple doors, and are usually located further away from them, which reduces your wiggle room, requiring efficient movement. Another example are the enemies, specifically the ghosts, which are placed in natural and predictable locations that can't compromise your run. However, the further you go, the more they appear next to hourglasses and keys, which can disturb the flow and make the sections harder. In other words, smart movement is rewarded over anything else. Unlike levels like City Escape and Metal Harbor, which somewhat feel like a continuous sprint in a non-derogatory way, Pyramid Cave introduces slower sections more focused on platforming. Take as an example the swinging bars, which reward timing and precision by allowing you to avoid the slower section below, where you have to jump from platform to platform while they slowly go back into the wall as dictated by the hourglass. These hourglasses are also the main reason why a lot of people tend to not like the stage, since they involve waiting and are normally associated with completely killing your speed, especially when you hit them, which sometimes makes getting to the doors harder since all the momentum you had is gone. Of course, this exists to reward your ability of being able to build up speed in a short amount of time, but you can't ask for everyone to enjoy it. Another problematic instance of this are the enemies, which despite being in lower number compared to other stages, they act as space breakers instead of being actual encounters, with the ghosts especially affecting the level's flow in a negative way. Another additional example is the first large grind rail, which if you do fail to get there, you need to go through that slower section I mentioned, and even if it mixes speed and platforming in a reasonable way and does in fact require some velocity to go through, the little margin for error can feel a bit unfair at times, even if I specifically don't suffer from it. Crazy Gadget has sections that balance this in a better way, yet others that do it in a much worse fashion, so it is what it is really. Basically, the verticality of the level is used more often as punishment than anything, which only becomes mandatory in the section where you get the bounce bracelet. If you avoid all the punishing paths, you never even need to use it. Another section people don't usually like is that one where you have to get the key from far away and then transport it back, and that I can understand. I can't say that I'm the biggest fan of it, but I've had to play this level so many times for videos that I've gotten pretty good at it, so I don't really mind it anymore. The next segment can also be a bit frustrating, since you need to hit the hourglass hourglass and then get to the door really fast, which can be pretty annoying due to the ghosts, and yeah, I can agree that it's still a bit of a bad set piece. In all other segments not mentioned, you only need to stick to the main path, so there's nothing much besides that. Exploring the slower routes gives more items, as well as in other hidden ones, like the Flaming Spring, that aren't so obvious. Even with all of this, the flow of the level is still good when there aren't any ghosts. There are a lot of loops, downhills and rails which exist to naturally build up Sonic speed, combined with other elements like dash panels to help in slower segments, and the level being more linear than normal makes it feel a bit more focused considering the stage it tries to be. Once again, the gimmicks aren't for everyone, that's why it's so polarizing in the first place. I did used to hate this one, truly, but the more I played it, the more I enjoyed it. However, you can't expect anyone to start saying something's good by playing it 1,000 times. Regarding aesthetics, it's a very well designed stage given what it tries to represent. Considering how the level takes place inside a pyramid base, it does transmit the idea that you're inside a gigantic and haunted pyramid, with the used assets, namely the colors and hieroglyphs, resembling ancient Egyptian architecture, as well as decorations to fit with the level theme, like cobwebs and other abandoned stuff. However, in my opinion, it's the level that probably offers the less visual variety, even if it's to be expected. The puzzle element of the level also fits pretty well with its atmosphere, since the pyramids are technically not fully explored and the puzzles kinda represent the idea that there's stuff still hidden, which in turn makes the fact that the level is more closed make sense. The stage also incorporates traps, which are usually associated with this sort of setting, scoring it points concerning cohesion, with the song tying everything up really nicely. Considering how SA2 is all about level variety, Pyramid Cave is an addition that makes a whole lot of sense and ensures that Sonic's gameplay isn't just running, but it's also platforming and exploration. This stage is truly weird. It both feels like a stage you'd expect from Sonic in this game, yet at the same time it feels really different, which just goes to show how remarkable it truly is. It's one that should be more iconic for both its good and bad, and one that should be getting more attention for how different it is compared to everything we've seen from Sonic games of the same style. And lastly for this video, let's take a look at one more stage in another 3D spin-off, Misty Lake from Sonic and the Black Knight. It's the first and tutorial area of the game, a placid waterway filled with grind rail-like vines and townspeople, as well as ancient palaces that sit abandoned inside the calm waters of the lake. Now, being honest, point a gun to my head and ask me to name 5 stages from Black Knight. I'm dying. I have never ever seen someone talk about the levels from this game besides maybe Camelot Castle, and even then very superficially. This game is like Secret Rings in the sense that the only things you see being talked about are the story, the music and the controls, yet it features probably the most beautiful settings out of any Sonic game. Misty Lake is a tutorial stage, which means there isn't much to be said about it regarding its level design. It follows sort of the same philosophy and basic blueprint as Secret Rings, so there's no point in me repeating myself. In other words, this will be a quicker coverage. However, the gimmick here is the sword, which means you get some areas where you use it to combo targets and get more points and speed, also teaching you that you shouldn't attack the townspeople, and block these boards into the air as well as fight a small boss. It basically teaches you the ropes, and that's about it. It does it well enough, which is better than some other levels have done or will do in the future. What I do want to talk about regarding this stage though is everything it is besides how it plays. This is probably my favorite level out of any in the franchise when it comes to looks. It takes place in these overgrown palace ruins under an overcast sky, with lakes and little islands surrounding them where the fog has set in. There's something so inherently beautiful about this mix of human-made structures that were taken back by nature to some degree. It's an aesthetic that I just can't get enough of. The rail segment, where you go all around these ruins with vines and branches climbing and connecting different walls and also enveloping the camera with arches, is probably my favorite from any game, and basically nothing even happens. That's the simple power of environmental design. The intricate and ornate designs on the arches, pillars and torches that can be seen in and around the environment also add a very majestic contrast to the otherwise abandoned look of the crumbled bridges and pillars, making it still look very appealing. There are also some other cool details, like ducks in the lake, frogs that jump out of your way when you pass them, fireflies, and also moss growing on the walls submerged underwater. The foresty areas you go through are also very beautiful in themselves. The track that plays throughout is a different rendition of Night of the Wind, yet it fits the level like a glove. It does truly feel like you're going through ruins of a castle during medieval times. It's all done so perfectly to a degree that it's weird that no one really discusses this. I wish I was more knowledgeable in this field to make justice to how well designed this all is. It's an aesthetic that I wish was used in games more often, and it's done perfectly here. I don't even like this game that much, to be honest, yet its first level is one that, despite not having any emotional connection with it, resonates with me a lot when it comes to mere vibes, because that's what this level is. Just imagine being here specifically. It'd be awesome, if you take away the events of the game, that is. But yeah, I guess that's about it for this video. I'm not any expert when it comes to analyzing whatever I did in this video, I'll always be the first to say it, so if there's anything you think I made a mistake on, please feel free to correct me in the comments. Once again, this will most likely be a series of sorts, so be sure to comment with some levels or sections of that you think are overlooked or forgotten and why. They don't have to be good specifically, they just have to mean something to you, because at the end of the day, that's what matters. An objectively 7 out of 10 game that speaks to you directly means so much more than an objectively perfect 10 out of 10 game. The same goes for stages really, although to a lesser degree, since the meaning someone holds of them only goes so far. Yet it's still an important factor to consider and speak up about. Why do you think so many people like Sonic 06, despite it being an objectively bad product? It speaks to them, either due to its story, setting, atmosphere, or the memory one holds of it. And as long as that matters to you, no one can take that away. So yeah, if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications, as these videos take a lot of effort to plan, write, edit, you name it, so I'd be very grateful. You can also support me on Patreon or YouTube memberships to get early access to videos, your name in the screen at the end, and other exclusive stuff I might intend to do or post, as well as follow me on Twitter if you want, and check out my community tab once in a while, where I post quite frequently with video news. And that's about it really. I'll hopefully see you soon.